Hello, and welcome to Varn blogging with Red Opal Century co-product. And it sounds like a corporate on Decadence Theory. And we are going to be responding to the response to the ICC's Decadence pamphlet, but we're really referring to Aufheben's Decadence, the Theory of Decline or Decline of Theory, parts 1 through 3. I highly doubt we'll finish it today. But once we get through this series,
yes,
we will start talking about Ross Dunhat's book on decadence. So we're going to go over to the conservative land for a second on something other than boundless and bottomless, and talk about decadence and conservative thinking, which I've become fascinated with because I kind of think that conservatives are going to have a hard time with the fact their politics accelerates the decadent spirals they're complaining about. But that's not a new observation.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think that I'm looking forward to getting into is since conservatives are obsessed with culture, there's a lot more about culture included in their decadence theory, and I'm interested in diving into that. And then also just like other things that leftists don't generally tend to talk about, like demographic decline and things like that.
Yeah, usually it's like Mark Fisher or David Graeber, and that's about it.
Yeah, my two bet nors. I
mean, there's a reason why though, because nobody else covers it ever.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think we go through waves of, like, I was thinking about, like, reading Jacobin articles in different time periods and what the obsessions were. And, like, during Trump won, Trump won, but the ascendance of the DSA to its almost 100K members back in 2020, which they are probably down to.
It's like a different
between 70 and 50K, depending on what source you look at. Yeah. It's very interesting to think and talk about it. But my point is, like, when the left seems to be culturally focused when it's culturally ascending, and when it's culturally descending, it gets all either foreign policy driven or materialism driven, as kind of a defense to the fact that it can't do anything in cultural hegemony anymore. That's my reading of that cycle. But, if I find it fascinating that leftists have they have no problem being determinists about everyone else, but they have a very hard problem being determinists about themselves. So, but I'm going to say what I said when we started this series. So for those of you who are following along, you can find this Aufheben article in the show notes, Decadence, the Theory of Decline or Decline of Theory. Because this has an agenda, but I'm not quite sure what its agenda is, because this seems like it's part of the communization debates. And the reason why I say that is, who else is going to care to respond to the international communist current, a weird Italian left com adjacent council com tradition that doesn't have that many people and can be super annoying when you encounter them, this much theoretical heft? And also, why pretend that this was mostly a left com or Trotskyist thing? Because it's not like these crisis theories weren't all in Marxist Leninism land until the 1970s, where they gave up on trying to make economic predictions.
Yeah, they really kind of gave up on economic, like developing new economic thought at all.
Right.
And like likewise, this is the Second International has its own sort of decadence theory. Yeah. That sort of that evolves into Bernsteinism, or whatever, revisionism, and that is also not really touched on.
Yeah.
No, they do. it comes up as like a paragraph in part 3.
Yeah.
And then we don't really dig into it at all. And I was like, okay, so we're not going to talk about why because third periodism in Soviet Marxologies, for those of you that's appeared between 1927 and 1936 in the Soviet Union specifically, where they and I find this funny, actually, we're basically outside of Bolshevizing the party. Marxist-Leninists believe the same thing as Bordegists, like that we were in a terminal decline, that we needed party dictatorship, that the only united fronts that were viable were united fronts from below and through unions. You couldn't work with other political organizations. But what people forget is that wasn't just justified as a response to fascism, which it partly was, but it was also justified as a response to the fact that they thought that fascism and World War was actually forestalling and crash. Like, Grossman is not that out of step with Soviet Marxology, actually, and that's Henrik Grossman. This article doesn't touch that, so just bringing that up immediately, because I was like, okay, we're not going to talk about the fact that these theories were mainstream until there was a revision of monopoly capital theory in the 1950s, which ML's all adjusted to, which is why the Monthly Review has always maintained that weird Baron-Sweezy monopoly capital stance pretty much unwaveringly, even which is about denying the tendency of the rate of profits to decline. And I find all of these interesting because I end up fighting with people about like what defines neoliberalism, and when I say it's like public-private partnerships and whatnot, people act real stupid as if they don't understand what I mean.
I think people's understanding of neoliberalism, like most leftists' understanding of neoliberalism, is either David Harvey's fault or just a symptom of the same understanding of neoliberalism that David Harvey has, and that is that it's libertarianism, right?
Yeah. That it's just laissez-faire, which is just not remotely true when you actually look at policies.
Right.
Like, the percentage of people working for the government has gone down. The percentage of money and influence spreading through government contracts and stuff has dramatically increased. So while there's less people working for the government than in the Fordist period in the United States, there's a shit ton more people dependent on the government. And I don't just mean like in terms of welfare. I also mean in like our tech oligarchs are not possible without government contracts for a decade and a half after, and QE making venture capital investments a way to hide money from taxation. And the reason why I say QE doing that is QE made those investments, even when they were poisonous, not actually fall apart and people lose a ton of money immediately. How it does that is a matter of debate between MMTers, Marxists, and anyone paying attention. But I find all that interesting.
Not a huge pool of people.
Yeah. I find it interesting, though, because this is a purely economic theory of decadence. I will repeat that it's like the only reason they're calling this decadence is that the ICC, the International Communist Current, called it decadence. Otherwise, everyone else refers to this as crisis theory.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's either final or terminal crisis theory or crisis cycle theory. So like, so I found that frustrating because I was like hoping that there would be a more materialist understand of decadence on culture, but leftist, aside from their talk about professional managerial class stuff, and I feel like I'm asked to talk about this all the time, and I don't really want to anymore. But they don't have a theory of decadence anymore, even though they have a class theory that they try to use to explain decadence, I think.
Yeah.
I think the PMC is a thesis to explain the decadence of the Bernie Partist movement, as I now call them. But okay. So let's at least get into number one. people should find this on Limcom. It's old as fuck too, so there's a whole lot of like I was thinking about this. I'm like, in 2005, you could think the business cycle was mostly over because there'd only been the .com bust. But
right.
in 3 years, the business cycle is going to reassert itself like a motherfucker, and then theoretically disappear for another decade. After
it's going to disappear. Out. It's going to disappear for like the 10th time, and then reappear with the.
Well, I mean, if I'm looking at the stats right now, and look, I've been wrong about the economic stats before. This is what I think we're going to have to get into today. But there's a lot of recession indicators.
Yeah.
Right.
The thing that mutes it. Go ahead.
I was going to say, whenever you said, "Oh, this is really old," and I was like, "It's from 2005. It's not that old." And I was like, "Shit, dude, that's 20 years ago."
20 years.
I've been having that realization too all the time, Chris.
I was like, yeah, and even then, I was fully an adult and living on my own in a house that I was renting. I mean, yeah. I've been an adult and a leftist for over 20 years now. And I got to tell you, man, I should have just been a normie.
Yeah. That's the thing about leftism is that it's pretty decadent.
Yeah. Not a cool decadent either, like where we like lounge on couches and gorge on fancy food and stuff. It's a lame decadence that sucks.
Yeah, it's Findicicla without any of the fun.
Yeah.
So this is I find this article interesting in that it does give you kind of a historical development of crisis theory with the caveats that I said, that it underlooks at the Second International, even though it mentions it, and what that did, and the debates that caused. So it led to Bernsteinism because there was this idea to explain how it led to Bernsteinism, because it's not immediately obvious, but basically they thought that proletarianization of society should be a lot more of society. They define proles as almost strictly industrial workers. That mistake is not new or unique to contemporary leftists. It was what the Second International really believed. Although it's interesting that they believed it, because the more I'm reading Capital Volume 2 and 3, the more I'm like, why would you think that Marx is just talking about formal sector industrial workers? There's actually no reason in the book to think that.
It's easier, I think.
It is easy. Well, they're easier to organize.
Yeah, that's
it. Is old shop floor organizations way easier to do. I mean, one of the ironies that I haven't heard anyone talk about is centralization of the economy has also led to hyperfragmentation of production, even though the administration of that production is hyper centralized now.
Yeah.
But it's just the administration of production. It's not like the actual physical production mechanisms. They're all over the place. So
yeah, I mean, it's Matt Christman made a funny comparison. He talked about the American proletariat isn't like the peasantry that Marx referred to as potatoes in a sack. We're still individualized. We're like, but we're processed and stacked like Pringles. We're more like Pringles in a can.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was funny.
So going back to I do think it's funny. I have a hard time when people ask me right now, when people talk about the reason why the Long March to the academies happened, and I always tell people, well, leftists, the new left didn't start really doing workerism until the late 70s, and that happened to correspond with a financial crisis, high levels of distrust between different sectors of the working class, and the beginnings of deindustrialization. So, when they actually tried to do it, it was already too late.
Yeah. That's
I would
sort of
love
the
a
way we
decadence
roll
theory
in the
that dealt with
American
that.
world. Yeah. We're going to have to come up with one.
Yeah, I mean, because I do think like the frustration thing I'm getting from these left decadent theories is frankly, is either denying that the concept has any validity whatsoever, like it, which I find bizarre, or it's hoping that the tendency of the red profits the fall leads to a decadent scenario, which will lead to probably immiserationism or accelerationism as a thing that makes people go into, depending on whether or not you're a communizer or a normal Marxist, a working class revolt or whatever the communizers are talking about, riot com or whatever the fuck.
Instant communism.
Yeah.
And it is important to point out that Aufheben, some members of it became the British section of Endnotes. So this is tied to, this is proto-communization theory.
Okay.
So
that makes some sense, yeah.
Yeah. Because one thing that you have to remember about communization is they tend to be iffy on whether or not they think the working class is going to be a universal subject.
Right.
So
I mean, the broad gist of this seems to me to be sort of admonishing people to completely ignore any ideas of a decadence theory and rejecting crisis theory instead of decadence theory, which is what they're actually doing, and then advocate for creating revolution. I think that's what this is. Yeah.
So this is a hyper-voluntarist notion of revolution.
Right. Rather than, the way a normal Marxist would look at this and think, well, at the point in history where it is applicable, human beings should assert themselves to help, ride the wave of change and push it in a certain direction. Rather than
to give history a push, but also like recognize the moves even when you don't push it.
Right.
Well, I guess maybe we should have a conversation before we get into this about the difference between voluntarism, determinism, and whatever the fuck Marxists are doing. Because I do think, classically speaking, Marxism is a deterministic but not determinist philosophy, meaning that we do think human agency and something like mitigated will, I wouldn't say maybe free will, but mitigated will in aggregate can change the direction of what otherwise seems like arbitrary events, so that you can actually manifest changes in history instead of them being stochastic. So the promise of communism is that the technological and social forces are developed to the point that you can start actually planning for the future instead of just letting it happen to you.
Right.
That's the old Marxist gambit, but it's hard to get people to understand that because there's this binary between deterministic and voluntaristic thinking, not just in Marxism, but in like everybody's thought, right? Yeah. Like you got the naturalists who believe in agency and the ones who don't. And you have the compatibilists who believe that we have agency, but we might not have free will because free will is a stupid idea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that you have to remember in these debates is Marxism doesn't say much about individual consciousness. Historically, or at least not early on. That's like a Lukács Second International focus. It matters
and
to
really
Marx
kind of almost.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there may be a few others. There's like Labriola, and there are a few people who comment on the sort of around the edges, but really it is like a post World War II concern.
Right. And what defines post World War II Marxism? Explaining why crisis theory was wrong.
Right.
That's literally that. You can literally follow the socialism is inevitable to the socialism is something we have to build debates. Mm-hmm. The socialism is inevitable is winning that for most of the 19th and early 20th century. The socialism as an act of will becomes much more of a bigger deal after the Bolshevik and Chinese Revolution, and after the prediction of an economic crisis after World War II doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah, like the fortunes of social democracy as a distinct tendency are very much that's you could peg it to that, because you could watch the inevitable march become a march in a different direction.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these concepts that you're going to have to get through before we even get into this article. Because the one thing I will say about this article is, if you don't already have a fairly adroit understanding of socialist history and basic concepts, this article is not going to make any sense to you.
Yeah.
You guys agree with me on that? Like, I don't think this actually, I don't think this by itself would actually be a good way to understand crisis theory if you didn't have some understanding. So maybe we do need to talk about it.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So what do we mean by the tendency of rated profits to fall? Okay. So the tendency of rated profits to fall is that for whatever reason, and the reason given in Capital Volume 2, which may not be true, to be fair, is that the organic composition of capital, aka
Well, I am not an economist and not the most well-versed in Marxist economics, but I always thought of the rate of profit to fall manifesting itself, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall manifesting itself to us as being pretty evident. But, I mean, there are lots of arguments as to why it's not, and I'm not super well-versed in those. But that is what the underpinning of what crisis theory is that inevitably there will be, the means of production. I mean, the profit will have declined to a point where it is capitalism can no longer squeeze anything out and starts cannibalizing itself, and then causing it to go into crisis.
Right.
Right, and there's there's a basic instability. There's just like all of the countervailing tendencies which allow for the system to kind of readjust itself. And so there's a bunch of that I've never really been super good at and comfortable with. It doesn't really matter, because basically what it suggests, what it says to me, is that capitalism is an unstable system, and so it's to stabilize itself is inhuman. There's all kinds of things that are inhuman as a direct result. That's about it, though. It's one of the many things about the structure of our economy which I just find to be detestable.
I will say that part of the problem is most people don't define profits the same way Marxists define profits.
Right.
So a lot of people will say, well, there's massive individual accumulation of wealth in the stock market. So we have profitability. But that may only be profitability by, for example, dealing with the fact that commodity costs in one area because of divided and uneven development are much lower than commodity costs in another. And that looking at profits in terms of individual income or even individual wealth belies the fact that you may be seeing declining profits in per unit sold physical commodities, which I think is undeniable, because it's the only thing that explains all this move towards rentierism again. You have a hard time explaining why everybody's trying to turn everything into a rent if you had a highly profitable commodity market.
Right.
But where I do agree with the criticism of crisis theory, I don't think there's any reason to assume that that automatically leads to a socialist revolution at all.
Right. There's nothing about that at all.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessary.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't think it's necessary to think that decadence or crisis theory is correct. I mean, I don't think it's necessary to believe that revolution and socialism, communism, whatever, is inevitable to look at decadence and crisis theory and think that it's at least partially correct, that there is this tendency for capitalism to become unstable cyclically, and that we might be past a point of capitalism having any sort of progressive value at all.
Right.
Yeah.
So
the only other thing I was going to say was that the tendency, the desire, or the tendency to see it as an inevitability has historically led to some really, really bad practices, or the lack of practices at all.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what Aufhebung is getting to in this essay that we're going to finally start discussing. But I also think the hyper-voluntarism is also not really going to help. like it's just like the idea that if the idea that if all we do is convince everybody that they're going to have to live in some commune form, and then whatever crisis, but not an economic crisis, interestingly enough, for the Endnotes people, usually it's an ecological crisis, will force us. I actually don't see how that's that different from this form of crisis theory either, but it's just we don't need the working class anymore. It seems to be the implication,
right?
All right,
which is seen as convenient for some people, I guess, but I don't see how it is. It seems very illogical.
Right. So let's get how Aufhebung defines this. Because one thing I'll say is they actually do like explicitly intertwine three different concepts. So this is from the first part of the episode in introduction. One understanding that has been dominant among critics of capitalism is that the capitalist crisis, especially a prolonged and severe crisis such as we are presently in, is evidence that the capitalism as an objective system is declining. Were we in a long and severe crisis in 2004, 2005?
Well, there was a downturn after 9/11. Right. And it was, I remember it being people talking
severe,
about it but yeah, it was a recession.
Right.
Yeah, and it sort of, but I mean, I think that it wasn't severe and it wasn't long, but I do think things leveled out relatively quickly. But they never adjusted themselves back to the way that they were before. There was like there always is in any sort of crisis, a massive transfer of wealth upwards that never comes back down, and then there's inequality is just adjusted that much more. So things are a little bit harder moving forward forever.
I think that you could from a certain perspective, in the mid-2000s, you could say crisis to talk about if you were talking in terms of the overall crisis of like the culture, but in the terms of this person's talking about, no, I don't think so at all.
Yeah. I find this fascinating because on one hand you can argue that we've been in an economic crisis since the end of Fordism in the 1970s, right?
Well, yeah.
Because that was hidden not by mass unemployment but by stagflation, and stagflation leading to a doubling of the workforce almost, because most women entered the workforce in the 70s. One of the things that Christopher Lasch is right about is like corporate feminism was a good way to cover up the fact that you were actually inflating your way into much lower variable capital cost and labor.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable truth that adding women to the workforce allowed everyone to be paid less.
Right. And they hid that because of the discrepancy between nominal and real value, which is another problem when they're talking about the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, is that we don't have a world currency standard to which to measure all this stuff other than fiat currencies trading potential. Which is, that's like the MMT critique of Marxist crisis theory, although they don't really believe that value exists. So it's just Euclidity. Anyway, let's read this. The meaning of decline is either that it's created a basis of socialism and or that it is moving by its own contradictions towards a breakdown. Capitalism, it is said, is a world system that was mature in the 19th century. Again, what are we going to say was, I don't know, as a world system, I don't think capitalism was mature until the middle of the 20th.
Yeah, I would.
Sorry,
I would
guys.
definitely say it took World War II to make capitalism a world system.
Right.
I mean, in this particular case, it kind of depends. The development of capitalism between a few Western European states is relatively advanced enough to where, like Engels could say, we're ready now.
Yeah, he actually did say it in the 1880s, but at the same time, and that's also why Sombart was calling, the late 19th century late capitalism, which seems hilarious to us because we're like, well, if you start capitalism in the 17th century, we're like a century and a half out from when you guys thought it was late.
Right. So, there's an old social democracy which is rooted in a certain understanding which says that this is mature, developed capitalism. But it's also not worldwide. And so from Luxembourg on, you have to kind of update a lot of these things.
Yeah. Then they assert it might seem a bad time to critique a theory of decadence in the face of widespread disillusionment with the revolutionary project and with a lack of understanding of working class offensive. There is an understandable temptation to seek refuge in the idea that capitalism as an objective system is, after all, past its prime, moribund, heading towards inexorably towards collapse. Well, one of the things I want to point out about the tendency of the great profits to fall is, and one theory, it leads to capitalist breakdown, but there's another theory equally valid that I think is an equally valid reason, reading of Marx, that it's just what drives the business cycle.
Yeah.
Like, you have a profitability crisis, and then you have to get rid of all this overproduction, and you do that through basically slashing capital value and laying off workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which also means there's less consumers, blah, blah, blah. And this leads to the underconsumptionist, overproductionist debates, which seem like they're arguing the same thing, but they're actually not, in that while the answer to overproduction would be to increase consumption, it matters what order you think that happens in as to how you economically answer the question. So to get to what I'm talking about, if it's overproduction, for example, you can fix it by capital destruction, including war. But if it's or anything that's going to destroy a lot of capital, if it's under consumption, you stimulate the economy so more people eat up surplus, and thus cause more liquidity to enter the economy, which both sound like they mean the same thing. But if you kind of think about what their implications for policy, they're actually very different. Because if it's overproduction, stimulating the economy won't really necessarily lead to a decline in the pace of production to fix the problem. Underconsumption was Rosa Luxemburg's theory. Overproduction is kind of Lenin and Second International's theory. I think overproduction is also, is Marx's theory. That doesn't mean it's right, but it's something we have to deal with. And again, I bring that up because, like, this article at first doesn't make that distinction.
I feel like for a very long time, we kind of treated them as the same, or at least I kind of treated them as the same. Like
Marxist and Lenin's theories, you mean?
Well, overconsumption and overproduction and underconsumption as basically
sure, yeah,
different ways to describe the same phenomenon.
Well, here's the thing: the Marxist humanists, and that's the Marxist -humanists, not just Gramscians or whatever. This is their politics are based totally on this, and they're really like, that's why they also slag on Rosa Luxemburg so much, because they're like, she ruined Marxist value theory and led to something like MMT, happening in Marxism. Okay, so they're like, well, we are in a. I think one thing we can say in the aughts, the left was in a crisis. Was general society in a crisis? That's a different question.
Yeah, that's a very different question.
Right.
Like
the left in the aughts. Oh man, that's when I came into the left.
Right, the left was in a crisis. The left was in crisis because the general society was not in crisis.
Right, and because
the left needed it to be in crisis.
Right, just when we thought we were getting somewhere, as the collective left thought it was with the anti-globalization movement, 9/11 happens, and everyone becomes just the most slavering right-wing imperialist, like even your good comrades, you know.
Right, and then there's an overcorrection to that where everyone becomes slovenly Marxist-Leninist campus, kind of.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's the hard overcorrection, and as in us in the ISO, we were good third campus, which means that we were good, first campus.
Right.
Arguing constantly against people who were like, no, we should, like, what's going on in Libya is actually bad, and we're like, no, it's good. Just not the NATO part. Like, that fucking can be separated from what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely to our eternal shame.
Yeah.
Like we have to do penance for the rest of our lives for that.
Well, I also think you guys were in a like you guys were in the ISO, which was by far at the time probably the largest revolutionary quotation marks organization on the American
in the US
left.
for sure. Yeah.
And it had been largely revitalized by its British component. I can tell you, as a person who dealt with Code Pink in the early PSL, that they were like critical support for Al Qaeda and Ahmadinejad in some ways. So it was just like, it was a plethora of
very confused.
It was a plethora of bad options, right? Like it's like
right.
Pretending that like the cluster of countries that were not able to integrate into the New World Order, and we're not talking about China here, were somehow really existing socialism. That was a thing that's come back. It's a dumb move, but
that's back in a big way now.
Yeah,
with the success of BRICS, the recent success of BRICS.
Well, it's interesting to me that we seem to be in a time period where the vices of the left of the 90s, 80s, and aughts, and maybe the late 70s, all exist simultaneously in the same group of people. Which is a heightened contradiction, but
it's the way in which everything's kind of stalled out. So like fashion, music, technology, politics, it's all just rehashing of what's already been in shorter and shorter.
Although I'm going to push back on that a little bit in the sense that like that's only not been true for capitalism during the middle of the 20th century.
Right. I mean, I think that's true also.
In its most dynamic era.
Right.
Yeah.
Because like when I think about part of what we're experiencing, because I think about this in recurrence of like the capitalist realism argument that, we can't imagine, we can more easily imagine the end of the world, of the end of capitalism. Like, well, actually, we're not even there anymore. We can more easily imagine the return of feudalism than the end of the world.
The end of the world. Right.
Right. So even that's wrong. But I do think that there is something to the idea that we also are setting our norms for the Fordist period, which are objectively the height of capital mitigation of its own crisis theory, although it hit a wall within a generation. Ironically, from a geopolitical standpoint, we were also not in a unipolar or a multipolar world. We were in one of those few times in history where you had a bipolar world.
Right.
Right
until
now? Oh, okay.
No,
in the mid-20th century.
Yeah,
in the mid-20th century.
Gotcha. Yeah.
We had a bipolar world, and we only became multipolar when China broke off from the Soviet Union. Like, that created 3 poles, and that's when everything got really unstable.
Right.
Like,
Not for very long either.
As it is now.
Yeah,
we're back to the 3-pole system. Interestingly enough, if you would have asked me in 2005 who I thought if there was going to be a multipolar world, I would have for sure told you that Europe, a strong, united Europe would have been one of the poles.
Yeah. Maybe that'll happen now, but I doubt it.
Yeah, I kind of doubt
it. 20 years worth of rebuilding their industrial capacity before they can even be anything like a military power ever again.
Well, here's the thing, though. I mean, Germany does have industrial capacity.
It does. It's been consciously dismantling it, though, for the past decade. So they're going to have to redo it. I mean, they could very easily, but I don't think Germany is big enough and has as much of an industrial capacity as, say, like maybe China or Russia. Certainly not Russia or China or the United States, but maybe Europe under a united economy could, but like, good luck uniting Europe.
Right. Well, I was about to say, it seems more like the tensions within that block are going to break it up.
Like, for sure.
Like, I feel like, because the EU in some way is kind of a nightmare formation in that it's like not very democratic, but allows internal democracies to exist. So you have a lot of internal contradictions between the undemocratic nature of Brussels bureaucracy and the democratic nature or the quasi-democratic nature or whatever of the parliamentary democracies who still have sovereignty over everything but their economics. That's like a terrible idea. Like,
if Europe gets, I mean, if the European warmongers get their way, and Europe does increase its military spending to create a united European army, it's going to take some severe austerity and cutting of social programs to get to that, and then they're going to. We'll just see how well Europe sticks together once they start cutting all their social services in order to fund a European army.
Yeah. I mean, because I don't mean to agree with Trump on much of anything, but he was right that we were fronting a lot of the cost of NATO. To be fair, I mean, it's our imperial project, so we should. But
it's like 80% of it, though. I mean, and like Americans, we don't have social welfare so that we can have the most ridiculous military in the world. So I guess it's Europe's turn.
I mean, again, that's part of when I say, like, there's an aspect of this multipolar emergent world that I think is good. It's different than saying whatever. It's just that we should recognize that to continue on with what has been is the only way to guarantee that nothing changes and nothing's ever good is ever going to happen. So the multipolar world, I'm for it. Not because I am not of the political bent which sees anything else in it other than just new chaos and thus new formations and new opportunity.
Sure. Could be worse.
Go ahead.
I mean, it could be worse. We could just have a much more unstable world and then always be on the brink of war.
Well, yeah. But I mean, I think that's part of it.
Statistically speaking, that is the most likely outcome. I mean, just like looking at periods of multipolarity, they are conflict prone.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what I mean.
And I think it's also the sides are going to have. I don't think any side really feels totally comfortable with the other. Like, there's, but Europe is unfortunately caught in the gristmill And in some ways, I hate to be this way, but is a return to pre-capitalist historical norms. Because for most of human history, Europe didn't really matter that much. So, like,
hey, but if the libs are right, Trump is going to be the new emperor of the United States, and he's going to be subservient to Putin. So we don't have to worry about nuclear war.
That's true.
Yeah.
Oh man,
that's good.
I'm not touching any of that. My funny thing is, it seems to me very clearly that if you don't believe in decadence, you have a hard time explaining what you're watching in the United States right now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
like,
for sure.
It's like you have a legislature willing to give up its rights that constitutionally it can't, and you have but the Constitution doesn't seem to work anymore. You have a legal system that like is totally incoherent at this point. And really has been incoherent since the 60s. We've only been using a dictatorial Supreme Court, mostly from the liberal side of things, to shore up social peace. And that's being undone. So eventually we won't have social peace. The people think, oh, the conservatives are just going to like become a dictatorship. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work for a variety of reasons. One of which is just like during the Bonapartist classic days of France during the various back and forth between the first, second, and third republic and the various French empires, the central government, even when it represents reaction, is not actually all that internally coherent at all.
Right.
Right.
So, whereas I will say, one of the things that we have to talk about is like, this is where I push back on like three worlds theory, because they're like, oh, labor aristocracy. I'm like, well, why wasn't labor aristocracy? The height of capital is the 1950s, but the height of American capital control of the world is actually the 1990s, which is not a period of like labor aristocratic period of privilege. It's just not. You can't make that
not
argument
at all.
No.
So it means that argument, which was articulated in the 1980s, sort of made sense, but like it's kind of been refuted by economic development since then.
I mean, it sort of made sense.
Yeah, I mean, it never made sense. The idea that labor aristocracy was somehow workers in the developed world were not exploited at all. That seems impossible, but the idea that like the productivity of the global South was being siphoned into things that helped American workers, that was true in the 50s, maybe in the beginning of the 60s. It's not true after that much, though.
Yeah, sure. Like when you think about like United Fruit and
right,
the Arbenz government, there's a kernel of truth to that.
But American labor didn't benefit that much from the next round of imperial negotiations during globalization. Like that actually didn't help the American labor movement at all.
Yeah, it's actually, again, it's like I don't for some reason this is really absent, but like part of what neoliberalism has meant that anything about a global economic assessment from the 1950s has to be reassessed from the 1970s onward.
Right. I mean, because if you look at what looked to be the hope of the third world, which was that the revolutions would cause chaos in the first world because you would all of a sudden remove these colonies or pseudo colonies from the market that they needed to exploit in order to maintain the living standards of the first world. And then in every single instance, removing the giving liberation to these countries, not giving them, earning their liberation through, revolution and bloodshed, didn't disrupt the first world. The shift to neoliberalism merely integrated these countries back into the world economy, Vietnam and China and everywhere. I mean,
that was the whole point.
Yeah, exactly.
So
on to the third paragraph.
That.
Well, that
Yep.
takes us back to Sami Amin that we did last time we were discussing this. That's sort of his whole decadence theory is just based off of that weird third worldist understanding of decadence theory.
Yeah, although also anti other third worldists, because I'm like, well, this doesn't believe in labor aristocracy theory. That doesn't. I mean, like, I actually don't exactly, even after reading his stuff about tributary modes of production, don't exactly understand if he just thinks that all economies are just really probably naturally tributary mode, like, except for socialism and capitalism. But only reason capitalism isn't according to that was like an accident of timing.
Actually, I do think that's right.
Yeah,
Socialism,
that seems to be his
capital.
theory.
So capitalism, the rise of bourgeois society, is what breaks breaks us from this trajectory of various tributary modes and creates a possibility of the socialized mode. So that's exactly right. There are three in his conception, three possibilities.
Right, and I actually think that's not right at all.
I just think
I think tributary mode's too vague.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think the code of the court of like the caliphs in the 9th century works the exact same way as like Merovingian France or like the Byzantine Empire. Like it just and I also think it like doesn't deal with mercantile marketization, which was a thing as early as the 11th century. So
it's just too simplistic. It collapses too many things together.
Yeah, it flattens it out to make it easier to talk about, and then it basically loses all meaning.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's the thing. It's like it fixes one problem but creates two more that are worse.
Yeah.
So I don't want to throw like Samir Amin out, but I just also was like, so what does he think? The other thing is like, what do they think the answer to this is? Well, it's like decoupling plus world revolution. I'm like, well, how do you decouple if you still have to build up your industrial base? Which I'm going to go out and speculate here. Like, I'm not an anti-degrowther in the sense that I do think, yes, we have to stop wasting resources for stupid shit. But I think one of the reasons why a lot of people in the ML world like degrowth is it gets them out of the problem of being dependent on the capital world market for their internal development. But then they have to explain why no one ever does that. Like, why does no one follow the Khmer Rouge model? Because that's actually the implication of some of that politics. So like, but back to this. So in the theory of decline, a number of issues are intertwined. Now, here's the funny thing is I think they're the people intertwining this. They're being the writers.
Right.
Crisis, automatic breakdown, the periodization of capitalism into ascendant and decadent phases, the notion of transition, and the ontological question of the relations of the subject and opposite. At a general level, we might say that a theory of decline represents a way of looking at the crisis of capitalism that sees expressing an overall downward movement. The complication looking at the theory is that it has numerous versions. Among these presenting themselves as revolutionaries, the two principal variants are those of the Trotskyist and left communists, which are similar in origin, are substantially different in their effect on politics. For some left communist, politics is virtually reduced to propagandizing the masses with the message of capital decadence, aka that's the ICC stance.
Right.
While for many other Trotskyists, the theory is often more in the background, informing the theory of crisis and organization, if not their agitational work. Is he just talking about Mandelites there? Who else has a theory of crisis? Like, I guess the Sparts do. I mean,
I think he's when you talk about the Trotskyists, Mandelites are, especially in Europe, they're the main ones by far.
Right.
Well, here's the thing. Like, you guys were ISOers. Cliffites are the dominant in the English-speaking world for a long time.
Yeah.
They're not anymore, but they were for a whole long time, right?
Yeah.
Cliffites have a weird definition of capitalism.
It's literally everything except for like 4 months in 1917.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
like barely an exaggeration, actually. Which is why, well, yeah, whatever.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they have they're not just a state capitalist theorists, which they took from anarchists and left comms. They have the vaguest notion of what that means. Too. Yeah, right. Like, it's like, what's the element of capitalism? Value production. Well, where's the value being where does it have to be valorized at? We're not answering that question. The fact that it's valorized at all is what matters. I'm like, right. But then, like, why are you Marxist in the sense that why would you think a transitionary program was necessary? Because it would still be state capitalist by your definition, like, no matter what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just don't understand what. Whereas some of the council communists and stuff, they just deny the transit. They're like, that's part of Marx they throw out.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, so it's, you know, it is, you could have a transitionary program, right, where there's like elements of a market economy, and that's still not state capitalist. What makes it state capitalist is the surplus value being extracted by the state. So as long as it's the state extracting surplus value and not, I guess, councils, which to me is a state, but whatever. Yeah. I mean, it's very convoluted and weird, and I don't think Tony Cliff was anything approaching a theorist.
I mean, it basically just boils down to how decent the people in the state are.
Yeah, there we go. It says, are they nice? Do they have the correct leadership? Actually,
exactly.
Is the important question.
But we do have to remind ourselves that Trotsky was a breakdown theorist. He wouldn't use the term decadence, but he was a breakdown theorist. And like, one of the things when people clean up the transitional program document is they always drop the fact that Trotsky predicts that capitalism is going to collapse of its own accord in the 1950s, and that's why the transitional program was necessary.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And everyone just drops that out. There's like, we're not going to talk about Trotsky being wrong about the prediction he made and the death throes of capitalism and the blah, 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 because that's where our transitional program definition comes from. Also, none of us agree on what it means. Some of us think it's the same thing that Marx argued against Gaudet to do, which is to pass reforms that are impossible and piss everyone off when they don't work. And somehow that leads to a left-wing revolution.
Yeah.
Even though it's the left-wingers fucking everybody over. Yeah, that's never made any sense to me. Like, I understand why Marx was like, I'm not a Marxist if that's what Marxism is. And then watching the ISO Trotskyists bring it back, that's always been like, what? But yeah, it's, I know we're all shitting on Trotskyists because two of us are former Trots. One of us is former Trot adjacent.
You're a former post-Trot. Yeah. We're former Trots.
Yeah, I started where Trotskyism ended. Like,
it is also just the case that, at least in the U.S., the American left is Trotskyist or Trotskyist adjacent or formerly Trotskyist.
Right.
Like, literally, that's just what defines our left. That's what defines all of it, from the DSA to the PSL. With the exception of the CP, but you know, anything critical, anything that if you ever encounter anything which is like nominally an independent, critical, socialist, anything, it's just to some degree is informed by Trotskyism.
Yeah, I was about to say, even if you're not a Trot, there's so many people who, even on the Marxist-Leninist side, who actually have Trotskyist conceptions of politics and don't realize it, and they just slag on Trotsky all the time, but don't realize that like their politics is actually closer to Trotsky's than it is to like the official Comintern communist parties of the 50s or whatever. Like, the other thing I would also say that the American left has been dominated by Trots and Maoists forever, because they're both. While Maoists now are copacetic to a socialist state, historically speaking, they were both opposed to the official communist doctrines coming out of the Comintern or Common Form for different reasons. But, you know, And yeah, most of the Maoists were Stalin defenders or Stalinists, but they were not, like the CPUSA was markedly unsexy.
Yeah.
Right. The Maoists were just the Trotskyists.
Right. Well, there's a good argument in both France and I have a whole book that argues it, actually. It's back there. That both France and the United States and in Britain, Maoism and Trotskyism both serve the same role, which is to actually pick up activists more tied to the university student, and also to be an explanation of why the Soviet Union was beginning to look so decrepit. So you had a Maoist, like Soviet defensist, but also everything's bad in the Soviet Union after Khrushchev line, and then you had a Trotskyist. Well, it's been fucked up since either 1921 or 1927, depending. So there you go. And left communism is interesting because it seems to rear its head whenever there has been an anarchist movement or a social democratic movement that failed. So it made sense that you started seeing left communism coming back at the end of the alter globalization movement. And that it stayed back until the DSA replaced the kind of anarchist left. And we'll probably see it come back again when people get burnt out for being. Well, let's also be honest. A lot of Marxist Leninists today are actually ultra in their politics, but not in their rhetoric. So it's because they're not doing electoral work or anything, like not in any meaningful sense.
Yeah.
All right. So let's continue here. I don't think it's fair, however, how much he threw together in this. And he was well, I shouldn't say they're like, all this is tied in the theories of decline, but they're all different. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but if you acknowledge that they're different, why are you all calling them the same thing?
Yeah, like a few more explanatory notes might only make this too dense.
Mm-hmm.
But really, it's like this paragraph is a couple of paragraphs, maybe a couple of pages to explain and to defend.
Yep. I can kind of tell this was written in 3 different sittings, though, because one of the things I noticed rereading these is that they repeat themselves a lot from section to section. So as we go through this, it'll get easier because it's like, well, they've already stated this. We don't have to recover this again.
That's true.
The crisis of capitalism are seen as evidence of a more severe underlying condition, the sickness of the capitalist system. Capitalist development brings about a steadily increasing socialization of productive forces. And at a certain point, the capitalist forces of production are said to have moved into conflict with the relations of production. The concept of the decline of capitalism is bound up with the theory of the primacy of productive forces. The driving force of history is seen as a contradiction with its relations of production. It is quintessentially a Marxist theory in its understanding of the basic Marxist position and preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy. For most versions of this theory, the change from mature to declining capitalism is said to have occurred around the First World War. Is that true? I feel like a lot of people think it's actually the Second World War. But...
it depends because I think it's largely true, or at least it was. Like Hilferding, Luxemburg, Bukharin, Lenin, they all mark the First World War as the beginning of a crisis, and Trotsky calls it a terminal crisis. And it's only when that doesn't actually
of Marxism's decadence theories that they discuss are, early 20th century. They move on to later ones, but like for the first section that they discuss, it's almost all First World War. The currents of thought that were just came about right before, during, or after the First World War.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to read what they list as these theories. The present form of capitalism is characterized by declining or decaying features. Features identified with the change are a shift from laissez-faire to monopoly capitalism. That's Bukharin. That's why I'm surprised they keep on saying this is mostly Trotsky and left communist. The dominance of finance capital, that's Bukharin and Lenin. And the increase in state planning, war production, and imperialism, that's Bukharin and Lenin. And maybe other people too, but monopoly capitalism indicates the growth of monopolies, cartels, and the concentration of capital, which has now reached the point of giant multinationals disposing of more wealth than small countries. That's not what they thought monopoly capitalism was before the 50s, though.
Right.
They thought it was the state being involved more.
That's very different. Yeah, it's a very distinct. It's almost like it. Whatever. It's just, again, it's like this needs explanatory notes.
Right. You need a note saying that Bukharin's definition of monopoly capitalism, which informs Lenin's theory of imperialism, is actually not identical to the Baron and Sweezy thesis or the Friedrich Pollock Frankfurt School thesis, which Heinrich Grossman was arguing against.
Right. Just because it says the words monopoly and capital doesn't mean that it's the same.
At the same time, the phenomenon of finance capital, large amounts of capital are seen to escape the linkage to a particular labor process and to move in short of short-term profits. That's Mandel. And Mandel doesn't say that happens to the fucking 70s. So, although it was a theory in the Comintern used to explain fascism at one point, so, which was funny to me because fascists were also complaining about finance capital because Jews.
Right.
Right.
So,
and that's, I mean, the Comintern idea of what fascism was just capitalism in crisis,
right?
Just a complete flattening of any sort of explanatory power that might have had.
I hate to say it, but if I think you guys came to this conclusion when you did this episode on what fascism was. That God, you did this. You must have been 7 years ago now.
It was like our second episode or something, or third episode.
Yeah. But going back and looking at it, it does seem like if you split the difference between the left and right opposition and the Bolsheviks, between the Trotskyists and Zinovievites on one end and the Lovestone and Bukharinites on the other, you actually do have a good theory of what fascism was, which is basically Bonapartism in crisis mode as a way to manage a capital crisis, which is much more clear than what the fucking Comintern was talking about.
That was our Marxists in the Face of Fascism series that we did. That's actually a really good book.
Yeah. It made me less sympathetic to the Frankfurt School because I'm like, so the Frankfurt School basically says everything's fascism anyway.
Yeah.
Well, that's also what most people on the left say today. Basically, what most people have said since the Frankfurt School.
Right, they won as far as their popularizing their version of what fascism is. Anyway,
it's funny that people think when I call stuff Bonapartist that somehow that is nicer to these people than calling them fascist, and I'm like, well. Except for the Nazis, Bonapartists killed probably more people than fascists, sans the Nazis, which is a pretty big asterisk. I'm not going to lie, but because that's like 10 to 15 million right there. But
I think the reason why people think it's nicer is because fascist just has been so it's been used as such an epithet for so long that it sounds like the worst thing that you could say. Like I forget the comedian, but he said something like, some people say when you say midget, that's like saying the N-word, but the difference is pretty stark because the first word you can say, the second word you can't say.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's got like fascism has like a demonic quality almost. It's like, it's where you elevate it above the, any sort of conceivable regular realm of politics into a thing that is just the ultimate enemy. So giving a pass to pretty much all of American history by making the thing that's happening right now into this foreign entity,
Right.
Or conversely, trying to pretend that the Confederacy was fascism because fascists stole elements from it.
Or that. So when people say like America tends toward fascism.
It was like, okay, sure. No. Like we tend towards Bonapartism and racism and sometimes authoritarianism and but like those are all kind of separate from fascism.
Yeah. Fascism is a unique blend of all those things plus some more stuff.
Yeah.
I find it. I have a theory. My theory as to why people do this is that it's similar to yours. Is that fighting fascism is the one-time anarchists, capitalist liberals, capitalist skeptical liberals, communist of all variety, except for Trotskyists. We're not talking about that too much. We're all unified together to fight something.
Right.
Well, right. That's the birth of and the longevity of the term left. When you say the left, what you're referring to is the broad collection of everybody who says that everything else is fascism. If you abandon that notion of fascism, you also have to kind of abandon that notion of the left. And I think you should. I think we should be in favor of socialism, not the left. But
yeah, it's an interesting problem, but I also think what people tend to focus on is like the left as opposed to the right. And sometimes I'm like, maybe we should just be focusing on what these people's policies, agendas, and ideologies are. Like,
sure.
Like Trumpism might be fascistic. It may even be fascist. I don't fucking know. Part of it, I'll tell you my two theories. That's one theory. My other theory is people like semantic debates because you can be smart about them and still know nothing. Like if it's about the logic of a word, you can argue that indefinitely in an intelligent way without a whole lot of actual research or facts.
My theory is that being anti-fascist is much easier than having like positive politics. Right. You could just be against the bad thing and you don't ever have to come up with a way to keep the bad thing from happening. Plus it's fun. It's fun to LARP.
Yeah. It's kind of like how ever since like 1999, being the anti-capitalist was like, that's the thing that I'm against capitalism. I'm anti-racist. I'm anti-capitalist. I'm anti-fascist. But what are you for?
Well, I want to actually, even when you do spin this positively, and I want to use an example of the MAGA people here, they're not really for anything either. No. Like, even though they have a positive framework as opposed to the left negative one, the details of their positive framework are self-contradictory, don't make any fucking sense. And like we're gonna have austerity and right-wing populism at the same time. Like that's gonna fucking happen. Like, so I bring that up in relevance to decadence because to me it's proof that we live in a decadent time period.
Yeah.
Well, and like you said, Trumpism might be fascist. I mean, it's like in as much as it's got any coherent elements, then sure.
But but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't actually match historical fascist movements.
Oh yeah.
And we just have to then go have a semantic argument about which ones were the most essential to fascism. And then by the end of it, I'm like, ironically, if you do that enough, you do end up at the Frankfurt School position. Well, it's all fucking fascist anyway, because like there are elements to fascism in everything.
And I maintain that the most important element of fascism that makes it so dangerous is the sort of anti-finance capital portion of it, like the corporatist element of it, which none of these modern like fascist or post-fascist movements actually have.
Right.
You don't have the thing that circumvents the left critique of capitalism.
Yeah.
And they don't even pretend to. There's no posture in that direction either.
Right. It's like Orban and Bolsonaro and people like that. They're like, oh, they're fascists. Well, they're certainly strongmen that sit on top of a democratic state and probably abuse their constitutional powers in the process, but they don't have this sort of populist critique of finance capital, and they're essentially neoliberals in every single way.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing is, ironically, the first Trump administration, kind of neoliberal. Second Trump administration so far, ultra neoliberal.
Yeah.
like neoliberal ways neoliberals weren't happy with in the past.
Right.
So I don't know. To me, I will say one of the frustrating things about this is I want to be like, why don't we talk about how capitalism made everyone smarter and then made everyone dumber? Or why don't we talk about how capitalism made us all live longer, but then made us all fat, and now we're not living as long anymore? I mean,
decadence. There we go.
Right.
We're back around to decadence again. It gave us all of the things that we needed to be able to live longer and have healthy, full, fulfilling lives, and instead we can't access it because we can't afford it, and we're all fat and falling apart and dying early.
Well, I mean,
and also cancer.
And cancer. Yeah.
And cancer.
But like being raised poor is actually the strongest correlate to being overweight. Like,
sure. Yes.
Like it's like, come on. You took a group of people who historically were starving and you somehow made them fat and yet also not healthy.
Right.
Like
now getting gout is something that happens to poor people instead of like medieval nobility, right?
Right.
But if you ask the left, actually all the bad things are good.
All the bad things, yeah, exactly.
All the bad things are good because they happen to poor people, which are a category of virtuousness. So they're actually good.
I actually do see this a lot of left-wing research that I've pointed out. If you look at the left-wing research on metis, which is like the Aristotelian category of cunning, which they see in poor people. Like poor people have the metis to navigate the system. They have this inherent, almost standpoint knowledge, right? I've actually pointed out that, like, well, when you do that, what you're saying is you don't even have to reform your stupid system because the poor people already know how to secretly navigate it, and they're secretly somehow doing well despite all objective indicators to the contrary. Humanities conceptualization, like, it is funny to me how, and this is a Frankfurt School thing, but so much of the love of the underdog is actually also being like, but we don't really have to change the system. Not really. Like, since fat shaming doesn't work, we can't talk about obesity rates. Even because BMI is bullshit, and it is. We shouldn't talk about obesity rates. You can be healthy at any size, except, that's actually harder to prove than either way than anyone thinks. But
right. Some individuals are healthy and overweight. That is true. Right. That is an undeniable fact. But like overall trends, if we're going with the only things that we could possibly do to make generalizable conclusions about things, we would have to conclude that generally it's not, Right. But and I've also seen the idea that burning calories doesn't actually cause people to lose weight, which is the wildest thing I've ever heard in my life.
I've never heard that. Yeah, that's
I have.
Yeah, it's out there. It's a common trope on the left. I mean, I don't think we should fat shame people. I don't. Yeah. I think we should give people healthy options.
Yeah.
Affordable healthy option.
I'm just saying, and also quit talking about affordable healthy options when you're not talking about time expenditures.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
Who can afford to buy expensive food, and then who has the time to go home and cook it?
Right. Even if you, like, my thing is like, I can buy some healthy, cheap food and often do, but then I have to spend an hour and a half cooking it, and who has that fucking time?
It takes way more time to cook whole foods that you buy at the store than it does to just microwave something or pick up like fast food or whatever.
And there's so many things about this, like people celebrating the decline of literacy as if that's a good thing. Right. But for me, that's like the most obvious thing where decadence really matters, because like,
yeah, that's where the right-wing decadence theories are kind of also true a little bit.
Right. Well, yeah, there are elements of them which are absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny to me that like when I talk to about education, I'm like, this has become a right-wing talking point, and people go, "Nuh-uh," and I'm like, well, why don't you talk about it? And why am I listening to liberals tell me why people being illiterate is actually a good thing?
Right.
Because I have plenty of, and leftists just don't talk about it at all. They just avoid it.
Did you see that? I mean, this might this is like almost seems like just rage bait to me, but it wasn't. It was an actual article in a British newspaper, I think, that talks about how reading to your child gives them an unfair advantage.
Oh, I did see that. Holy shit.
And I was like, dude, I'm going to read to my child even fucking more now after reading this.
It was like when people were talking about how middle class time preferences were inherently racist, as if somehow people of color don't have certain cultures that are more respectful of time differences than not.
Yeah, and it's the same sort of discourse about like expecting leftists to read is racist.
Ableist.
Racist and ableist.
Yeah.
I was like, no, I guarantee you, like, people of color know how to read. Sorry.
And value it, actually. Sometimes more than white people do, frankly.
Sure, yeah.
Like,
I feel like when it comes with students that I was tutoring, whenever I was a full-time tutor as a job, my most determined students were generally people of color. My laziest and worst students were white kids.
Right.
Yeah.
Which actually would stand to reason in a logical, common sense way, right? Like, it is more useful and more obviously useful to people who are desperate than to people who are relatively well off. Like a lot of the students that I was tutoring were only in college because they had athletic scholarships. So if they didn't do well in their courses, like they didn't maintain a B average, they would get kicked out. So like the white kids that I like, a lot of the volleyball girls that I tutored were they just didn't give a shit at all. Like, but like it's like some of the black kids that were on the football team or ran track or whatever were the best students I ever had. Yeah, I just like when I like teaching at community colleges more than universities, like personally, because my community college students actually listen to what I fucking say.
Sure. Yeah.
Like
dude, oh my god, like my freshman I have an upper division course this semester, but last semester I had a freshman survey course, and those kids, like 80% of them, they didn't give a shit about anything, didn't show up, didn't even fully answer questions on their exams. You know, it's wild that these people are in college.
Well, another standpoint of decadence for me is like, well, colleges don't make money from what they say they do. They make money from endowments and hospitals.
Yep.
Or they're going out of business. If they actually make money off of education, they're becoming harder and harder to sustain. But yeah, so I mean, this is me arguing against an article while agreeing with their critique of a lot of what they're critiquing. But I just think, I think this first part, we're going through it slowly, but I think there's so much. I can't tell if it's conflating on purpose or if it's just trying to cover too much in too short of a time space, but it does seem like a problem. We'll talk about like another thing they bring is statification is seen as evidence of decay because it shows that the objective socialization of the economy is snarling at the bits of capitalist appropriation. I do think, for example, the stock market is socialized capital ownership. It is. Like,
yes,
to have a savings that where you can outpace inflation in a modern capitalist economy, you have to be 1 billionth of a holder of capital. So you got to be like one cell of you has to be a capitalist for you to have any savings at all.
Which is why I have none.
I mean, but like having know how to play the stock market is interesting. That is a collectivized form of capital development. It is not entrepreneurial, and yet the advantages from that, for example, that we saw in the mid 20th century in Fordism are all gone now. What do we have now? Short-termism that doesn't just cannibalize the working class. Capital cannibalizes its fucking self now, just like this would predict it would.
Yeah.
Like, why would you be running your actual businesses into the ground to increase your stock inputs if this was not a decadent system at this point? Like, and we have like, and leftists don't talk about this. I think partly because Marx doesn't talk about this, but well, I shouldn't say leftists don't talk about this. Marxists don't talk about this. Like, talking about the ways in which corporate capitalism really is kind of a different beast than entrepreneurial capitalism at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It's super fucking raceful. In fact, if you want to have fiscal discipline in the United States, where do you look? Do you look to capital or do you look to a local government? You look to a local government because they're actually limited by their revenues and no one else is.
Right.
The government isn't, large corporations aren't, like venture capital startups aren't, but local governments actually work efficiently because they have to, which is the opposite of what you would predict from classical capitalist theory.
Yeah.
All right. War production is a particular. I'm for those of you, I'm skipping around the key points. I think this one's actually fucking super valid. War production is a particularly destructive form of state spending, where large amounts of the economy are seen to be taken up by essentially unproductive expenditure. Literally unproductive because they blow up. Like if you actually use your munitions, they go away. And thus, interestingly, the whole Fordist development was kind of built on the war economy because you could, like, if you're developing stuff for war, that is necessarily going to be less given to overproduction because it's not really on a market for normal goods. It's on a market for people who want to buy it to destroy it effectively in its use. That's different from a commodity, any other commodity anyway. Like... the epoch is in fact said to be initiated by division between the great powers since they fought 2 world wars to redistribute the world market. Wars and threat of war are seen as evidence of capitalism's only way of continuing to exist by its destruction. I don't agree with that even crisis theory says that wars and the threat of war are the only way of continuing to exist by destruction. I actually don't think that's true. We destroy all kinds of other shit all the time. One of the things I'll say today is capital valuation gets destroyed in valorization all the fucking time. So let's look at the example of Elon Musk, the richest man in the world. He is actually, from what I can tell, for the amount of wealth that he owns, quote unquote, actually fairly cash poor.
Yeah.
So he leverages the cost of debt to write off the cost of taxes. But also it means that since his valuation is on stock, if that stock drops or actually gets traded in mass amounts, not for its valuation, we discover that the value never existed. It was fictitious. But we can't actually discover that until someone goes to sell capital or you have a market collapse. That destroys plenty of shit without war. Like,
yeah.
No, but like
look at 2008.
Right? This is a very commonly held position, though. That
what?
the war and threat of war as evidence of capitalism's only way of continuing to exist.
Ironically, it's something that left communist and Marxist-Leninists tend to both believe.
Yeah.
That's why you have every time that there's like a capital crisis, you have people freaking out that there's going to be a war automatically. And you're just like, why do you think that? There's plenty of other ways to get rid of capital. One way is just to transfer it up. So.
Right.
So
and
it's just,
like if looking at the, I mean, one of the things I always thought was just sort of threw a wrench in that way of looking at, the reasons for going for war would be the war on terror, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like the minuscule little wars, save for the war in Iraq, because that really was a massively destructive war that a lot of people got really rich off the destruction of that capital and rebuilding of that capital.
Yeah.
But like the world, these miniature police actions all over the world
just cost people money.
Yeah, exactly. They were tremendously expensive. Like 20 trillion is what we spent last time I looked. Like,
and then another thing is like this also assumes that there's mass participation in the organic composition of capital. Okay,
right.
And for those of you who don't know what I mean, because that's a weird way of phrasing things for non-Marxist, but that You need more physical overhead than you need labor right now to get something off the ground. But once you do that, you don't actually employ that many people. So it's not a way to spread out capital dividends to a market that can thus reabsorb all the production, right? Because so that's why Fordism doesn't work anymore,
Right.
For people who don't figure that out, and people.
That's like most people haven't figured that out.
No, I mean, well, most people think what the left should do is have, including a lot of critics of the PMC and whatever, is have their 1950s back.
Yeah. I mean, that is right. The Sanders kind of vision of
Sanders and Corbyn.
Yeah.
That's both what they really had on offer.
Yeah.
Okay. The crisis of social democracy and the literal collapse of the Soviet Union has been presented as a triumph of capitalism and as the end of history. In the West and East, it used to be possible to point to an inexorable advance of socialistic forms of apparently concrete evidence of the movement of history being progress towards socialism or communism. Skip a section. Now, with the move towards privatization of nationalized concerns in the West, yes and no. I mean, it was privatized, but it is not desocialized, which is a weird thing to say, but like public-private partnerships really are the private profit but public risk model of capital.
Yeah.
And the privatization of the ruling class itself in the East, the idea that there's an inevitable movement towards socialism, an idea which had been so dominant to the left for the last 100 years, now stands undermined, and the notion that the history is on our side no longer seems plausible. Well, I mean, people might argue that China's super efficient form of state capitalism, which I do think we can call China state capitalist, and I don't even mean it as an insult. Like,
no, I mean, yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I think that they think that they're building socialism, but currently it's, I mean, I think that they believe that they're building socialism is what I'm saying. It's like the Chinese believe that they're building socialism.
I actually have trouble reconciling Chinese statements to the Chinese Constitution in 1982 declared that they had actually achieved socialism. That's still in the Constitution to this day. But Xi is always, like, since he's coming to power, saying X date is good. We're going to achieve socialist modernizations and achieve socialism, and then we'll move towards communism. So I'm like, well, which is it? Is it what your Constitution says or what your policy statement says? Like, because I say this because people would be like, well, people have come back at me saying, like, have you read the 82 Constitution? And to be honest with you, I skimmed it, but I hadn't. So I read it and I'm like, oh, they do claim that they achieved socialism in the 70s. But now they're not claiming that when they do Politburo speeches. So I don't know what official Chinese government documentation is on this.
I don't even know why you would do that. Like, what's the point in saying we have achieved socialism?
It's a legitimization factor, so the party can stay. Because, like, after the Great Proletarian Social Revolution, it really would have been easy for China to slip in the Civil War.
Yeah, very, very, very much so.
All right. The abandonment of the idea of the historical development of productive forces as progress towards socialism, well, not in China where it's still seen as so, but everywhere else. And communism has resulted in three main drifts in thought. One, the abandonment of the project of abolishing communism and a turn to reformism as the existing system by the new realists, market socialists, etc. Jacobin, Dalinka after Jacobin took it over, Corbynism, Bernie Partism, etc. The postmodern rejection of the notion of developing totality and the denial of any meaning to history, resulting in a celebration of what was. I actually find it interesting that postmodernism has been it died in the mid-aughts and has pretty much stayed dead. Like, I was telling someone that we're still stuck in the 70s, but we were in the 80s and 90s stuck in the late 70s, and now, theoretically, we're stuck in the early 70s. Like, which I also like. Isn't that a form of regression? But anyway, because intersectionality theory and all that shit, standpoint epistemology, sub-Marxisms, etc., that's all early 70s stuff. And when that fails to articulate relatively quickly in France, you get the development of post-structuralism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, yeah, post-structuralism existed with Derrida going back to the 60s, but like it being so dominant requires post-Marxism to exist and Lyotard to leave Marxism and all this. And that's the milieu you and I grew up in. But ironically, we hang out with people who are younger than us, who are really into like the Kambahi collective, which is an earlier form of 70s leftism.
Right. Well, I mean, not to get Mark Fisher on you, but you know, it's the whole obsession with retro. Like,
yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It's like, well, we can still talk about the same Audre Lorde and James Baldwin quotes in the 90s as we do today, 30 years later.
Yep.
Okay.
Hey, when are we gonna get like a return to you know, shitty punk rock anarchism, just making zines and everybody like
I sure as fuck would like them more than I like some of the contemporary anarchists on.
Oh, absolutely.
Like I will say, anarchism has divided into two strains, which is both of them are retro, but one of them is the let's go back to the 19th century anarchist strain led by people like Zoe Baker, which I have some respect for, and then like then it's like whatever the Vosh is. This is a period of radicalism before I become a normal Democratic Party functionary, which is the dominant trend of anarchists since the anti-globalization movement. Not all, but if you're not a labor anarchist, that seems to be where you inevitably go, right?
Yeah.
And this leads to like even smart. I'll give you an example of this. Before people accuse me of being pro-Russia, I am not pro-Russia, god damn it. But I'm not anti-Russia either. Russia is just a place that exists. But my whole thing with like Rain Price, who I think is brilliant, but just totally buys the NATO line on Ukraine. Like no complications, no admitting that like NATO set the Ukrainians up, because that would admit that maybe there was a fault in the way Ukrainian nationalism played out after Euromaidan. And I think in terms of theory, this man is brilliant. But in terms of geopolitics, it's like, well, you're just like every fucking Democrat. Like what is that? Conversely, there are quite a few Marxists who are now just fucking Republicans, but like,
yeah,
still, it is
far
very
fewer
weird.
though.
I would say that like whenever I look back at a lot of the people that I knew from the ISO, their take on what's going on with Russia completely of any kind of support for you, just the wholesale like NATO line, you know, and that it seems to be a very, very large portion of the left takes that line.
I think because I deal with Marxism-Leninists a whole lot, I forget that sometimes until I deal with normal liberals. And I'm like, oh yeah, you guys all just like accept the standard NATO narrative about this.
Yeah.
Whereas
uncritically.
I have a very pox on all your houses, but maybe NATO's the thing I should be more mad about. Stance.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's how I feel about it too. Like Vladimir Putin, like the thing that makes me oppose Putin, it's the same reason I would oppose Zelensky. They both jail leftists who criticize them, you know?
Right. And I do think we have to admit that the West, and actually I would go so far as to say Europe more than the United States, which is a weird thing to say, but that the West really set Ukraine up. Like, yeah, and I say Europe more than the United States because I think about that what led up to Euromaidan, and that's Germany pulling shit as much as it is pulling shit.
Yeah, but as soon as
it's Merkel and then Johnson and then it's the US.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as soon as Maidan happens, though, the US is there dumping money into the opposition
that's true.
To fuel it. And then you even have like there's that Victoria Nuland phone call, like I'm sure you've heard it, where like she's talking to the ambassador to Ukraine, and they're picking who the next leaders of Ukraine are going to be. during the Maidan protests.
Yeah.
And I mean, it sure, like, yeah, I mean, absolutely, it was Europe, like, leading up to it, in Europe offering them that EU trade partnership and everything else that was the catalyst. But as soon as the United States realizes they could use Ukraine that could be fashioned into a tool to use to weaken Russia, then we're all on it,
But that leads us to how the intelligence agencies are decadent, because old CIA would have played all sides.
Yeah, right.
I've read enough about the CIA to be like, no, in the 60s they would have funded also the right wing response, and they would have funded a pro-Russian side. Like, they would have played all sides, which Putin does in America on the cheap. So, like, it does not very effectively, but I mean, they do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, like, it's like what JD Vance said about Romania. They canceled the elections in Romania because they thought it was Georgescu was being funded by Russia, which there's no evidence of that at all. But what they pointed to was that somebody bought a bunch of TikTok, paid for a bunch of TikTok ads to make it, look like the Russians were funding or supporting Georgescu. And it turns out it was one of his political opponents that did it, and not actually the Russians at all. Then what JD Vance said about it is like, if someone could spend $100,000 and completely destabilize your democracy, then you have a terrible democracy. And he was right.
Good point. Yeah.
Which, by the way, was basically the liberal argument for the U.S. Like,
yeah. Well, and the same point applies too. Like, Russian meddling in 2016. It's like, if that's what it takes, is that people on Facebook said things negative about your candidate, then yeah, your democracy sucks. And by the way, our democracy fucking sucks.
Right. Did you ever see they did some like analysis of how many views that the Russian ads received?
Not a ton
on Facebook. Yeah,
Not
hundreds.
Yeah,
hundreds of people saw them.
They're kind of ineffective. I mean, one of the things that I find very funny is just like, also, like, why are we mad? Like, we know that Israel and Europe do this too.
Yeah,
frankly, we know that. Like,
we know that Israel pays American college students to post positively about Israel, and it's not a secret. And also, we know that Americans get arrested for having someone donate on their Patreon who is located in Iran or Russia.
Yeah,
sometimes. Although ironically, it's Citizens United.
Not all the time.
But it's Citizens United that makes that easy to do.
Yeah.
I was actually telling someone, I'm like, one of the funniest things about Citizens United is it makes it very easy to be a foreign agent without even fucking knowing it. I really do believe that like Tim Pool had no idea Russians were giving him money.
Oh yeah.
Well, and then Vosh was receiving USAID money, right?
Yeah.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Literally being funded by the feds.
So I find this very interesting when we get into this, because this feels so divorced from now. Like,
it really does.
I think when I'm reading this, I'm like, this debate feels very like, would they still argue this today, that there's no truth to any decadence theory in the current environment? I don't know that these people would, actually. So I know that there's actually a strong decadence component, or at least a strong breakdown theory component to most communization theory, which makes this interesting that they were arguing against it for voluntaristic reasons 2 decades ago. All right, let's go back to it. So we talked about the productive forces, postmodern rejection. Okay, last one. The maintenance of an anti-capitalist perspective, but the identification of the problem as progress or civilization. Romanticism involves the decision that the idea of the historical movement was all wrong, and what we really need to do is go back. That's just primitivism.
Yeah, I don't think that's nearly as dominant, hegemonic. I don't think this is very large scale. I don't think this is. I'm not really sure why this is a point number 3. I think it should just be 2 points. But whatever.
Yeah, point number 3 seems to be like this weird critique of a fight within 90s anarchism, which you could say is tied into the degrowth socialism debates, but it's not really. The degrowthers don't want to like kill all technology and maybe lobotomize the human race, a la John Sarazen in 1996. But
I mean, there's a more charitable way to read it, which is that what they mean when they say go back, they don't mean all the way back. Like this romanticism of going back to the problem is progress and no, never mind. Yes.
Yeah,
you're right.
I would say we do see a lot of revanchist left movements that are basically Soviet, are Chinese, are social democratic nostalgia. I mean, I do think we should say that that's dominant today. But the going all the way back to primitivism and trying to argue that we can all be hunter-gatherers and like a 99% die off of the planet is inevitable. That was a very 90s aughts thing. It really didn't last very long after that. So
that's true. This applies to a small subsection of the anarchist left that was primarily located in the Pacific Northwest in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Right. And if you weren't involved in anarchist debates or zine culture, you probably don't know anything about this.
Well, we were involved in the hardcore scene, and a lot of the bands that we would tour with and play with were, because they were like vegan environmentalist bands, were primitivists.
Oh yeah, I forget about how well read Derek Jensen and Daniel Quinn were. Derek Jensen.
Well, we were in Austin too, where Derek Jensen was a professor.
Yeah.
Ah, yes. Before he got himself canceled forever, apparently,
for being anti-trans and anti-immigrant.
Right.
Like, what's funny though is that that all kind of started to disappear into the anti-Bush Iraq War era stuff. Like by the mid 2000s, it's kind of diffuse. It's not nearly so concentrated as, again, to warrant a third of 3 points.
Sure.
It's like 2 of these points are major for the time period. One of these points is very much specific to a scene, if we're completely honest.
The author of this is writing about a guy he knows, his roommate, his shitty anarchist roommate that doesn't wash the dishes.
Right.
I mean, it kind of reads like the way that people still talk about like offshoring.
Like we'll talk about the ACP as a major communist tendency and realize it might have 500 people involved at most. Like
like at most, but probably more like
50.
Yeah. No, this kind of reads like the way that when you read people talking about the offshoring of American jobs because of cheap labor, it's like 30 years ago that made sense. I don't really know if that should be talked about now. Not in the same way. At least you should talk about it as a thing which happened rather than a thing which is happening.
There is an offshoring of call center jobs, but but like, no, I mean, that happened. And in fact, when people talk about reshoring, I'm like, a whole lot of industry was reshored in the teens in the middle of the second Obama administration. It's just that they're so to finish up this definition here. I'm just going to read some key quotes and then we'll close out. For Trotz, the theory is less upfront. Actually, I need to read more than that. Hold on. I can't start with the for Trotz part. All right. We see the theory of decline represented by the 2 main factions of the left, ? Trotskyism and left communism. Well, why say that when you just mentioned fucking primitivism? Like there, I mean, to be fair, left communists do have a primitivist offspring in Kamat and Jacques Kamat, but that's it. And most of those people became anarchist. So
this is a much lesser offspring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the hard left communists, the Decadence Theory is for the forefront of their analysis. That's not true for Borges, by the way. I'm just adding that. That's only true for the ICC and maybe the ICT. Everything that happens is interpreted as evidence that decadence is increasing. I also find it interesting that they're not mentioning the Marxist humanists, who are probably even more attached to crisis. They don't call it decadence theory, but the crisis theory than even the ICC is.
Well, and also they, again, like when you talk about main factions, the Marxist humanists are larger and more influential than the ICC.
Yeah, the ICC, the ICC is like total nerd shit.
Yeah.
And like we know what it is.
Once again, it's kind of like your point number 3 is basically just about how a scene. When you talk about the main currents, and you mentioned the international communist currents, like I think that this is like you said, you're writing about a guy that you know,
right? For whom the capitalist crisis has become the chronic, all the great movements of the proletarian struggle have been provoked by capitalist crisis. That's the ICC. This crisis caused the proletarian to act and to become accessible to the intervention of revolutionaries. I want to point out, though, it is kind of interesting that Grossman, the Frankfurt School theorist, was initially super influential on Trotskyism and still kind of is. It was in Cliffite traditions, like he was resurrected in the Cliffites, but he himself was a Marxist-Leninist, and he got kicked out of the Frankfurt School for being a Marxist-Leninist. Like, I mean, that's not officially why they kicked him out, but that's why they kicked him out. Like,
yeah, and that is significant,
right? So, but the reason why he's associated with Council Communist is Paul Maddox Sr. Because Paul Maddox Sr. was basically the Grossmanite in exile until Banerjee, the Indian Trotskyist theorist, translated Grossman into English in the 70s. And then Rick Kuhn finished translating him into English in Australia in the teens and aughts, I think. So I do see why it's connected to the International Communist Current, which is a council communist group. But like, that's such a small fucking group. Like, they hit above their weight, but still, we're talking probably about 300 people worldwide, maybe 1,000 worldwide. Not, and I'm saying maybe. I have no idea, but it's not a lot of people.
Yeah, it's very much not a lot of people.
And nobody would have known who these people were even more than they don't know who these people are now in 2005. Did you know anybody talking about the International Communist Current in 2005? I didn't.
The only people I know that have ever talked about the International Communist Current are us when we're reading this article.
Right. I know more than that, but not a whole lot more. Like,
I've never actually heard it.
I really don't know anybody.
I have never heard anyone say International Communist Current until this recording.
But you travel in leftcom spheres. We don't.
Right. Yeah. So I do know some members of the ICC, but I can count them on a hand. Like,
right, and like the fact that I haven't encountered, not just haven't met anybody in it, but haven't heard anyone say that word, and that's despite the fact that I've been on the left and in various cities and pretty active for my entire life. That should say something.
So that's what he gets mad at the Council Communists for. But then we talk about the Trots. For the Trots, the theory is less upfront, but still informs their analysis and practice. Again, okay, which Trots? Because there's a big fucking difference between different Trotskyists. In comparison with the purest repetition of the eternal decadence line by the left communist upholders of the theory, the Trots seem positively current in their following a political fashion. Behind this lies a similar position, despite their willingness to recruit members by connecting to any struggle.
I mean, that sounds like Cliffites there.
Yeah, that does. That actually, I mean, to be fair, like Trot's trying to like show up. The what is it? The RCA used to be the IMT. Does that now? Like,
yeah.
Oh yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Well, they gotta do intrism, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The Trotskyist parties have the same objectivist model of what capitalism is and why it will break down. They gather the members now and await the deluge when, due to capital's collapse, they will have the opportunity to grow and seize state power. This is a position of Orthodox Trotskyism, which Cliffites aren't actually, although they heard a similar position. Is expressed by the founding statement of the Fourth International when Trotsky writes, the economic prerequisite for the proletarian revolution has already in general achieved the highest point of fruition that can be reached under capitalism. Mankind's productive forces stagnate. The objective prerequisite for the proletarian revolution has not only ripened, but has begun to get somewhat rotten. Without a socialist revolution and the next historical period at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole of mankind. This turn is now to the proletariat, chiefly its revolutionary vanguard, to the historical crisis of mankind, reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. And that whole Trotskyist is always the leadership fault, weird shit that they do.
So what's my problem with this is that, like, this paragraph, this statement, the little the quotation is so close to being right on. But I think for Trotsky, when he says that without a socialist revolution in the next period, a catastrophe threatens the whole of mankind, I think he would do well to have a sentence which said something like, and this is a real actual threat.
Right.
Like, because I think that the historical inevitability means for Trotsky, this catastrophe which threatens the whole of mankind is like, that's not really going to happen. And he would do well to say, oh, actually, it's entirely going to happen.
Right.
And it actually is happening.
So a significant difference between the theories of the Trotskyist vision historically identified the former Soviet Union as a politically degenerated part of an economically progressive movement of history, which I think is, I actually agree with that. Like maybe I am a trot somewhere deep down, because I am sort of like, even though I reject a whole lot of Trotskyist like terminology and frameworks, I am sort of like, yeah, the Soviet Union was a progressive movement of history that was also pretty degenerated in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like we're worse without it, but it also was not super great. Like that's my stance. But like, okay.
Yeah, that's the correct stance, in my opinion.
For the left communists, it has been exemplified by the decadence of the period. Thus, the Trotskyist theory of decline, which tended to see the Soviet Union as progressive and proof of the transitional nature of the epoch, has been more bothered by the collapse than left communists, for whom it is just a state of state capitalism, except for the Cliffites, who also have state capitalism.
Yep.
The thing about the Cliffites that make them so difficult to deal with is that there's elements of left communist theory, there's elements of right deviationist theory, and there's Trotskyism all in the same theoretical morass, but none of it's really spelled out very well. So
because there's some serious dishonesty when it comes to the intellectual inheritance and legacy within the international socialist tradition.
Right. Despite their antipathy to or the parts of the left wing of Capital's program, I also find that funny that we still use that as if there's something outside of Capital that's headily heading out these days. It is a general statement by Trotskyists about the decadence of Capital that the left communists find themselves in agreement with. In fact, the ICC even thinks that the inadequacies of Trotskyist theory stem from it not having a proper conception of decadence. The underlying similarities, both theories can be identified in the account of their history. Skip a line. Both trace their heritage through the Second International. And their arguments is whether it is Lenin or Trotsky or figures such as Pannekoek or Badiga that the classic Marxist tradition continued after 1917 or some such date. All right. And we're going to end here because the next one actually does get into the origins of crisis theory and the Erfurt program as far as like it being adopted. And that's a bigger topic. But it's weird. Go ahead.
That's that paragraph that you're talking about that mentions the Second International.
Right. But it's weird to like drop it in there and be like, oh yeah, it was foundational to the Second International too. And also by implication, when he was talking about monopoly capital, foundational to Lenin and Bukharin and thus Stalin.
Yep.
But we're just not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about these weirdos I got in an argument with once and Trotskyists.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, we're talking about their argument that they're having about weirdos.
Yes.
The Trotskyists. No, I like doing this sort of stuff. I think it produces useful conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it's necessary. I just find it I find it interesting because I also don't remember a whole lot of people who were final Crisis of Capital people until 2007, when there was a bunch of them all of a sudden for reasons that are obvious. Like, you know, but I don't remember them being super common in the early aughts, which may be why he's having to bring up 20th century Trotskyism and then the ICC. Because I don't think this was a period of crisis theory being super dominant. Am I wrong about that? But
no, not at all.
Yeah,
yeah, very much not.
No,
like, because I'm actually thinking about this coming out in 2005, going like, what prompted this to be written? Because the whole final crisis stuff really doesn't become popular on the left again until like 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. That's when everyone started talking about Grossman again, right? Like, no one was fucking talking about him before that, really.
I didn't really come across it until like 2016-ish.
Right. So that's when it became super popular if you weren't a DSAer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. My problem is I still don't know why this is decadence and not just crisis theory.
Yeah, still waiting on that.
Like, because both the ICC and Aufheben seem to use those interchangeably.
Yeah.
While they admit actually earlier on that you can't really use them interchangeably because crisis theory for them would be one part of a decadence theory. Like, I don't know. I'm very confused as to what they think decadence theory truly is. And I'm also confused at like how little objective economics or cultural commentary is in this. This seems to be all Marxiological and historiographic, not anything else. But we have gotten through 7 of the first 38 pages of the first essay of a 3-part series.
Oh yeah.
So, which is still better than something. God, how long did it take us to go through Eugenie Morozov's article, which was only like 7 pages? We did
like 5 episodes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
On 7 pages. Or like when we did Wickman, we did we did like 4 episodes on 4 pages and then glossed an entire book.
Yeah.
We were like,
whenever we did who was it? That was the Rodney Hilton. We just did a whole book in like 1 episode after spending 4 episodes on a freaking like a small article that summarized his position.
Oh man.
I mean, that's the value in front loading everything. It's like once you get that all out of the way, then you can kind of breeze through I
do think we have to front through this. The other thing though is I'm reading through this again. I'm just going to give people a heads up. Like, he'll mention somebody, will go away, will go back, and then it'll come back up almost as if new in another essay, like 50 pages later, as if it wasn't already spelled out earlier. Like that happens in these essays a lot.
Right.
And since I think this was a collectively written essay, it's probably because they couldn't agree on what to cut out.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
So on that note, hopefully we'll go a little faster next time. Maybe because there's less definitions. But on that note, we're gonna end this. And guys, we will come back. I know listeners probably think we haven't been gone that long because we release these way after we record them. And this might be released a little bit closer to the last recording, but for us, we haven't recorded one of these in three months. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So we'll get back into the saddle and try to get caught up. Meanwhile, you guys can live real life chaos while we're talking about it. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, what is our political system right now, if not decadent, right?
Yeah, it's just like imperial presidency's legitimacy. Like, all right. And on that note, let's end the show.
Говорят, рабочие и крестьяне не смогут прожить без нас. Без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, тянуть труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.